right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for joining us over your lunch hour today. My name is Andrea Lovoll. I lead the legislative work here at MCEA. If you're unfamiliar with our work at MCEA, we've been around for over 50 years using the law and science to protect our environment. And I am joined here by several of my colleagues to talk about defense at the legislature. So one of the things that we do at MCEA is we win a lot in the courts, but then we have to defend our wins at the legislature. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is what that means that we have to defend our wins from the courts at the legislature. So before we kind of get rolling into all that, I just want to do some introductions. So I'm going to hand it over to Kevin to start us off.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm Kevin Reuther, and I am the Chief Legal Officer and Deputy Director here at MCEA.
And Aaron?
Hi, everybody. I'm Aaron Klemz, and I am the Chief Strategy Officer at MCEA, where I work on legislative and communications work.
Ann?
My name is Ann Cohen. I'm a Senior Staff Attorney at MCEA, and I work a lot on the mining work.
And Nadia?
Hi, everybody. I'm Nadia Alsadi. I'm the Water Policy Associate, and I work in the water program.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. So if you're just kind of chiming in, looks like we've got some more people filtering in a little. My name is Andrea, and I lead our legislative work here. And today we're talking about defense work. To start us off a little bit, it's probably good to get a good understanding of what it is, the laws that we use at the courts, the laws that we use to have our court wins, and that's what we need to defend at the legislature. So I'm going to hand it over to Kevin to talk a little bit, just give a brief overview of what those laws are that we use in the courts.
Great, thanks, Andrea. And thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm sure that people want to hear about what's hot at the legislature, and we're going to get to that. But I wanted to take a couple of minutes just to emphasize how important this topic of defending Minnesota's bedrock environmental laws is. You know, the work that Andrea and our team is doing up at the legislature is really central to our advocacy. So first, I just kind of wanted to take a step back and explain that a lot of people think of MCEA because of our ability to go to court and our ability to win at court. What's important, though, is that those wins are only possible with strong laws. Environmental law isn't like some other areas of advocacy where there are constitutional constraints on the legislature. So you can think about, for example, when the US Supreme Court determined and decided that there was an individual right for people to bear arms under the Second Amendment, that really constrained state legislatures, it constrained Congress or local governments in what they could do to affect that right. Environmental law is really different. So far, at least, no courts here in Minnesota have found an environmental right in the Minnesota State Constitution. And the same is true about the federal Constitution. And as a result, when it comes time to go to court, what we're enforcing is really either a statute that's been passed by the legislature and signed by the governor, or the rules of the agencies. So as you know, agencies adopt rules and regulations. A lot of environmental law is in those detailed rules and regulations. And those are the things that we're focused on. All of those laws are subject to change. So what the legislature giveth, it can also taketh away in terms of your right to a healthy environment. As you can imagine, there are really hundreds of laws and rules and regulations, both at the federal and state level, that impact environmental issues and that we work with really every day. But I thought that I would highlight 3 state laws that, well, I want to call them out today because they're really important to our work. And they're often in the crosshairs at the legislature. And those 3 are Nepa, Mira, and Mappa. So MEPA is Minnesota's environmental review law. It's the law that requires all projects that may have a significant effect on the environment to go through environmental review. probably most of you have heard of environmental review. You may have heard of an EIS or an EAW. An EIS is an environmental impact statement. An EAW is a shorter kind of preliminary version called an environmental assessment worksheet. It's really the opportunity for all of us to learn about what the effects of a project are going to be. And it's an important opportunity for the public and for organizations like MCEA to comment on the project and try to make it better, point out problems with it, that kind of thing. So that's NEPA, the Minnesota Environmental Policy Act, the Environmental Review Law. The second law that I wanted to highlight is Mira, the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act. And that's really Minnesota's environmental enforcement law. It gives any person the right to go to court to challenge any conduct that's causing pollution. Both NEPA and Mira are laws from the early 1970s, when the politics around environmental protection were really different from what they are today. They're written with very broad, sweeping language, and they can be very powerful in protecting Minnesota's resources. The third law is MAPA, and I'm kind of collecting a bunch of stuff under MAPA that is scattered throughout the statutes, but any laws that have to do really with procedure. MAPA stands for the Minnesota Administrative Procedure Act, and it is what it sounds like. It sets out a lot of the procedures for the work of the agencies. For example, the process for adopting rules and regulations. MAPA, along with all these other agency procedural statutes, set out the basics for how an agency issues a permit, the process it has to use, who can object, who can ask for a hearing, how the hearing is conducted, who can appeal a decision and how that appeal is taken, all of these procedural issues that are really important to our work. And often, again, in the crosshairs up at the legislature from opponents who are trying to make our work more difficult. These are just three examples, right, of things that are really important to us. They're all laws that are frequently targeted by our opponents, especially when we win. So I think, Andrea, in answer to your question, why do we even need to defend our court wins? The legislative team's work beating back those attacks is really, it's vital to our success in the courts. We can only continue to ask courts to intervene on behalf of the environment as long as there are strong statutes and rules on the books. And that's why this defensive work is really so important.
Thanks for that, Kevin. That's a really good overview. And one of the things that I want to just emphasize in what you were talking about is that these laws can be changed at the whim of the legislature, whatever the legislature decides to do. They are not necessarily protected by being in the Constitution. It's something that the legislature can just change. And that's why we have to watch every single session, because there are so many attacks on these things that could be changed on a whim. A lot of the same things we see repeated over and over and over again at the legislature, in the same kinds of attempts to change the law so that it's different and changes the way that we would be able to defend the environment. So I want to talk a little bit about some specific cases that we've worked on at MCEA and how those have been under attack this session at the legislature. So I'm sure a lot of you on this webinar are familiar with our Limbo Creek case, but I'm hoping one of our lawyers or maybe Aaron can talk a little bit about Limbo Creek so that we all have a good grounding of what that case was. And then we can talk a little bit about how that's been under attack at the legislature this session. Who wants to take that one?
I can. I mean, so just a quick overview of the Limbo Creek case. This is the last free-flowing stream in Renville County. Folks who know the history of agricultural drainage know that the western part of Minnesota, for that matter, most of the state of Minnesota, was once pocked with thousands and thousands of acres of wetlands, many of which have been drained over the period of a century to really transform the landscape and make it more agriculturally productive. The downside of a lot of that drainage work is that it's really fundamentally transformed the hydrology of our entire state. And that is both true in terms of groundwater and surface water. By installing tiling on agricultural lands, basically water no longer filters down through the soil into the groundwater table. And instead, that water is being shunted off into ditches that are then directing that water into our rivers. So in the case of Renville County and Limbo Creek is a rarity, a water body that's not a ditch that takes that water straight from the field straight into the Minnesota River. One of our clients in that case, Tom Kalahar, who worked in conservation in Renville County for over 30 years, says that a drop of water that falls on a farm field in Renville County is in the Minnesota River within 48 hours of it falling on that field. And that's just a massive shift over the last century. And so when we were contacted by a number of local landowners and conservationists and folks from Renville County that were concerned about this proposal to ditch and straighten the remaining parts of Limbo Creek that are a natural waterway, we were really concerned because it aligns with MCEA's work to try to ensure that agricultural drainage isn't damaging water quality and also isn't causing flooding and erosion downstream. And so that case has been wending its way through the courts for a while. There was a proposal in 2016 to straighten this stretch of Limbo Creek into a ditch and make it into a conveyance for water rather than a natural water course. And we sued on behalf of our clients and on behalf of MCEA. And that case has gone all the way to the Minnesota Supreme Court. In fact, just last week, there was an oral argument in front of the Minnesota Supreme Court on this case. And it was really telling because in that case, we had an argument at the old chambers for the Minnesota Supreme Court, which are in the Capitol building, the original Capitol building where the Senate and the House is. Interestingly, the legislature was out of session, but there were at least 3 lobbyists who represent interests on the other side of that case. They're at the Supreme Court case watching the argument, right? So it's really interesting to watch the alignment between the court case and the legislative efforts to undermine it. So that's a little overview of Limbo Creek. I don't know if Ann or Kevin or Nadia, you want to add anything to that.
I just wanted to tie it back to one of the laws that I was just talking about, which is Nepa. So the actual issue in the case that Aaron is describing is about environmental review. We and a group of local citizens petitioned for environmental review of this project under MEPA so that the county would have to study what the effects of this drainage project would really be on the Minnesota River, because they just wanted to go ahead without doing that environmental review. And that's the case that we've won, right? So we won that case at the Court of Appeals. The county then sought review in the Supreme Court, and that was what argued very recently, and we're expecting a decision. But I think that there have been, in response, efforts at the legislature to exempt exactly what it is that we won on, right? And so this is a really good example of how our wins are based in state laws. Those state laws are subject to review by the legislature, and those wins can be reversed. And that's why the defensive work that we're doing up there and getting folks like all of you who are on the webinar today engaged with your legislators on these issues is really important. I don't know, Andrea, if you want to talk about the specific bill that was.
I think that's a really good segue into talking about exactly how this is happening at the legislature, how these things are being attacked. Limbo Creek is a really interesting case in terms of how it's being affected at the legislature or has the potential to be affected at the legislature. Because a lot of the attempts that have been done are directly aimed at exactly that case so that the case would be overturned or be nulled. So there are attempts to, for example, change the way the public waters inventory works. And that in the definition of what is a public water, there would no longer be the precedent to follow the public waters general definition and only give the protections to what is on the PWI, the Public Waters Inventory. And given that that list is incomplete and doesn't have a good process for adding or removing, that would take a lot of our public waters that are in Minnesota and remove protections for them for something like environmental review. So if there's a public water that is not listed on that public waters inventory, and you are concerned about some kind of project affecting that waterway, you would not necessarily be able to petition for environmental review because it doesn't appear on the public waters inventory. And there's a number of waters in addition to Limbo Creek that would affect. So it's a really important definition that we want to protect, and at least until we can fix the PWI as is the minimum there. Aaron, do you want to add anything regarding what is happening at the legislature at Limbo Creek or public waters?
Yeah, so just a quick refresher on this, and I know this is like super advanced stuff for a lot of folks, but I'll just be really clear and quick. Under Minnesota law, if a water body is a public water, it's pretty much required that you do environmental review of any project that would change the flow of that river or stream, would change its cross current, or to dam it or ditch it or drain it. And so the dispute about whether or not a creek is in this public waters list is really important because it determines whether or not environmental review is required. And so there's a lot of history here that I won't belabor, but the bottom line is that Limbo Creek is appropriately named. It was omitted from this original inventory in the 1980s because at that time there was another proposal to turn it into a ditch. And so in advance of that, they decided to just omit it from this list of protected waters. And so, there's a lot of dispute at the legislature. You may recall the buffer law a few years ago. There was a lot of dispute about which waterways would require vegetative buffers to protect water quality. And they used a different definition in that act to limit the impact of that and to make it so there were fewer waterways on that list. They used they call the Public Waters Inventory, or PWI, that Andrea talked about. So there are two prongs of this attack that are happening at the legislature right now. One of them attempts to redefine what public waters means under Minnesota statute, to say that only waterways that are on that incomplete, inaccurate list, the PWI, get the protections that public waters get under Minnesota statute, including the environmental review of projects like the Limbo Creek ditching project. The second one that I want to call out is about Mira itself, MEPA itself. And that is that under Minnesota Environmental Protection, under MEPA, on the Minnesota Environmental Policy Act, any citizen can petition for environmental review of a project they think will have a significant impact or a substantial impact on natural resources or water quality. And what happens at the legislature is there's a lot of belief that it's just out-of-towners that are petitioning the government for these kinds of things. So they've tried to limit who can petition for environmental review to people who live in the county where a project is proposed or an adjacent county. And we strongly disagree with that. Minnesotans know that our water quality and our air quality is not confined by county borders. We also know that folks across the state have attachments to different parts of the state, even if they don't necessarily live or own property there. And it's unfair to citizens of the state of Minnesota and residents of the state of Minnesota who care about these places to limit who can petition for environmental review. The last thing I'll just mention here is, again, this whole big fight is about whether or not we're even going to study what the impact would be of this proposal. It's not about whether the proposal moves forward or not necessarily. But we think it's kind of incredible that we've had such a long fight over whether or not we should do even the most basic forms of environmental review for a project that everyone recognizes would have a really big impact on the last free-flowing stream in a county. So that's a little bit of a nutshell version of what's happening in the legislature right now. Most of these provisions, by the way, are moving as part of the Senate's budget bill. And so a lot of these individual bills get rolled into bigger packages as the legislative session goes on. And so right now we're really focused on what's in the budget bills for the House and the Senate. That's where most of these policy provisions live right now.
Yeah, and I'd also like to add to that, Aaron, that I think that it's Also important to remember that waters in Minnesota do not necessarily respect borders of counties and states. So even if you have, a project that is happening in northern Minnesota that is not going to get environmental review because it's not in the public waters inventory, that waterway can still impact something farther downstream in the state. So if you live in a different county, maybe you live in something that is downstream, and your water supply would still be affected. This change that is proposed in the Senate omnibus bill would make it so that you wouldn't be able to petition even though you live downstream, and would be still affected by the project. This particular proposal we've seen a few times before, but just to illustrate that farther, if your primary residence is in the city and you like to travel up to the same rental cabin up in Duluth every year, or in Two Harbors or wherever you want to go, you wouldn't be able to petition for something that would affect where you spend your entire summers, because that is not where your residence is and you don't own property there. So these are just some examples of why that is a problem, especially for Minnesotans. We have a culture of going up to the cabin. I mean, you hear that all the time, of that we're going up to the lake, and that's what we do here in Minnesota. And this would affect that exact culture of what we enjoy in our state recreationally. So I think that's a good rundown of Limbo Creek. Does anybody else want to add anything about this case or about the attacks at the legislature and what that would mean? Okay, cool. So I think we can move on to another case. I think I'm going to hand it over to Anne to talk a little bit about 404 assumption. That has been another interesting issue at the legislature this session. We've seen a bill both on the House and the Senate side, and it's been put in the Senate omnibus bill as well, to assume the 404 permitting assumption. So I'm going to hand it to Anne to talk a little bit about what that means and how it affects some of the cases that we're currently working on right now.
Sure, thanks, Andrea. Well, so the 404 assumption question, okay, what does that mean? What is it connected to? How does this relate to the work that MCEA does? And again, I would say this issue is about, frankly, the issues surrounding agricultural drainage, which has a heavy impact on the water quality of the state. And in particular, this issue has to do with wetlands, which is something that unfortunately the state and in the entire country belatedly realized wetlands are very, very important for sustaining our ecology. And so what this has to do is a particular provision in the Clean Water Act, which says for waters that are subject to federal jurisdiction, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers issues permits, and those waters include wetlands. And the permits that we are talking about are wetland, dredge, and fill permits. So this program, the 404 program, is about who is going to regulate filling of wetlands. And so right now, the status is that for wetlands that are subject to federal jurisdiction, it is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that issues permits to people who want to dredge and fill those wetlands. And sometimes that's for the purpose of building housing, but more often wetlands are being dredged and filled in order to expand agricultural land. So again, we're in that really that area of tension in this state between agricultural interests and downstream interests. Anyway, there is the ability for a state to take over, to assume the 404 program. So instead of the Army Corps of Engineers issuing permits for filling wetlands, that authority would devolve to the state and local government. And so this is an area where powerful political interests are looking, because they feel, we think, that there would be a benefit to having this area be subject to more local control as opposed to the disinterested control of the federal government. So that's what this issue is all about. Anyway, one of the main questions here is, what are federal wetlands? And that is a really, really good question. And right now, that's an issue that's heavily in dispute at the federal level. And this is an issue that has gone on and on for years, and maybe we'll get some clarity this year, and maybe we won't. So, so that's why this issue is really so important. It involves drainage work, it involves filling wetlands, it involves those ecological impacts, and frankly, it's complicated.
Yeah, certainly complicated indeed. I wonder if we could have Nadia jump in and kind of ground for us a little bit about what it would mean to have local control, and for other states that have done that, what have we seen in terms of what's happened to wetlands, and you know, what would that mean for Minnesota?
Yeah, so Minnesota has a lot of wetlands. It's pretty important to protect them. When some states have taken that responsibility, just wetlands have lost some of those protections. That has a lot of impacts for water quality and our environment in general. So wetlands provide like almost a buffer for nutrients that are coming off of the landscape, whether that's in urban environments with stormwater runoff, or in our rural environments with the tile drainage, for example. We have lots of nitrogen and phosphorus entering some of those streams and then our rivers. So wetlands act as that buffer and sequester lots of carbon as well. So without those protections, they're at risk of being removed, or as we kind of mentioned, those downstream impacts, increased downstream flow from more drainage projects ultimately can flood out and remove wetlands permanently. Whether those dry out from being drained, or whether they're flooded out, either way. So we kind of just need to keep the wetlands where they are to protect our water quality. They're really specialized habitat for a lot of waterfowl. And we just have a lot of wetland area to protect here. So very important to keep the jurisdiction in the right hands.
And so if I can jump back in here, so, you know, MCEA's interest in this is that we feel that it is better to have that federal layer of control over significant wetlands, the ones that the feds exercise jurisdiction over, because there is a lot of pressure on projects like Polymet that are viewed as something that would bring economic advantage to a certain area or people. And so we feel that there's greater pressure locally to compromise on this issue of wetlands, and it's helpful to have the federal layer of control. And I might mention that today, this very day, there is a hearing going on where a federal permit is at issue for wetland destruction. And if the federal government was not involved in that situation, which involves Polymet, we wouldn't be having that hearing. So, you know, I should also note that we don't really lose protection as a state by handing off this authority to the federal government, because as a state, under the Clean Water Act, we do have the authority to add conditions to federal permits. So our environmental issues can be protected even when the federal government is acting. But if it's just a state permit, then we feel we've lost what potentially can be a very important form of protection from the federal agency.
I think that's this year, one of the challenges we have is that there is an attempt to basically preordain So let me back up a little bit. Minnesota has been talking for a long time about this idea of assuming wetlands enforcement from the federal government. I think it goes back over a decade at this point, if not further than that. It's also notable that when these proposals come forward, it's mostly mining interests that are pushing for these proposals at the legislature. One of the challenges the mining industry faces is that the area where they operate in northeastern Minnesota actually has about 90% or around that much of pre-settlement wetlands, whereas other parts of the state, in the southern and western parts of the state, have been largely drained, right? As I said before, Renville County's got one free-flowing stream left. Of course, in areas where there's been less development, there's going to be more of those naturally occurring wetlands that have been there since the last ice age. And those are also incredibly important to protect. So what's been happening is an attempt so there's been a lot of studies that have been done over the last 10 years or so about what it would cost and what the impact would be of Section 404 assumption. And there is a proposal right now in one of the budget bills, the Senate budget bill, to allocate money for that study. And honestly, I don't think MCEA really objects to the study. It's that, because I think we should have all the information in front of us as we make this decision. It's rather that they've preordained the result. So this statute that's being proposed right now would require the states to apply for Section 404 assumption by 2025, before we even know the results of the study that they're paying for. We also know that will come at a significant cost to the state. It's about $4.7 million of additional state spending every year. And the last thing I want to mention is just about the importance of notice and transparency. Frequently, especially when it comes to mining proposals, the first time we learn about a proposal is when the Section 404 notice is triggered. Oftentimes, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources or the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency don't make they don't see some of these changes as being major enough to trigger public notice, particularly the DNR. And so it's important. So the Army Corps' notice has given us the first glimpse at a number of mining proposals, including a massive buttress proposal for the Hibbing taconite plant up there. Some of the emergency, we learned, for example, in 2015 that a crack developed in a tailings basin dam because they had to use an emergency buttress to fill in some wetlands to shore up the dam. We would have never known that if it hadn't been for Section 404 notice. And so it is also concerning that we have better notice of some of these federal actions than we do of some of the state actions. And that's a problem that's beyond just this question of assumption. To be perfectly honest, our agencies, especially our state agencies, should be better at notifying the public of when proposals that affect the environment are coming forward. But it also does give us pause to think we might lose that notification if that 404 assumption were to move forward.
I'd also like to highlight something that has been kind of alluded to here, but Minnesota is also a host to several very old wetlands that are storing a lot of carbon right now. And the impact on climate change to destroy these, what are called peatlands, would be absolutely detrimental. And Nadia, do you want to say anything more about peatlands and about how important it is to protect them?
Yeah, absolutely. Minnesota has about 10% of our land is actually peatlands. Peat is super valuable. It's oftentimes harvested and used for a variety of different things. You might see it used in your gardens. So peat sequesters carbon at a really high rate. I could pull up some figures to determine what those exactly are, but peatlands are also home to really specialized species. And so sequester carbon at a really fast rate just due to the temperature, the climate, the hydrology of those specialized wetlands. So those parameters, those factors determine what makes a peatland, but then the rate at which they sequester nutrients is really valuable to offset climate change and then also offer those water quality protections as well.
Yeah, so it is definitely worth noting that we have these specialized kinds of wetlands that deserve a higher level of protection than perhaps what we could do with local control. And that's one of the reasons that we're so concerned about 404 assumption.
Can I add two things to that real quick?
Yeah.
One is that early on in the Polymet mine process, the federal agencies and the EPA identified the wetlands around the proposed mine as an aquatic resource of national importance, right? Which I think is worth underscoring that it's not just a local issue. This is an issue of national importance. I think another thing to really keep in mind is like there's actually good stuff happening here too at the legislature. In the House's environment bill, there is provisions that would set aside money to enhance peatland protection and to really emphasize the need to protect these wetlands. And so it's not all bad news, but I think it's also important to underscore that, like, I think we're really waking up to how important this is. In 2008, the state of Minnesota found that about 4.25 billion tons of carbon was sequestered in Minnesota's peatlands. That is basically the equivalent of about 8 or 9 months of US carbon emissions all at one time. So this is a huge amount, this is a huge carbon sink, and protecting and preserving the quality of those wetlands is really important.
Great. So some of the wetlands that that we need to protect are in some specific areas and that have the tendency to be drained out from wells. And so this leads us to another case that wasn't even our case, but it was tied to one of our bedrock environmental laws that need to be protected at the legislature. And therefore we got involved. And that is the case with White Bear Lake. So I'm going to hand it over to Aaron again to talk a little bit about White Bear Lake, why that is an area that we are concerned with, and what has happened at the legislature this session.
Thanks, Andrea. I want to go back to what Kevin was talking about earlier on about the importance of the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act and what it allows people to do. It allows citizens, any citizen of the state of Minnesota, any resident, to sue a polluter, but also allows them to sue a state agency or the government itself for allowing pollution or destruction of natural resources to occur. And in the case of the White Bear Lake, in the White Bear Lake case, a number of local citizens, after seeing the lake fall by up to 6 feet during a very substantial drought in the early 2010s, got together and sued the state, arguing that part of the problem was that there was overpumping of the local aquifer. A number of very high capacity wells are in the area near White Bear Lake, and hydrologists who studied the problem discovered that the groundwater table is really supplementing the level of the lake, and that overpumping was part of the problem that was causing the lake levels to fall. And this was threatening both habitat, but also water quality in the area. And so they brought a lawsuit in 2014, and it was basically, I might have the dates a little bit wrong here, but they filed that lawsuit early in 2012, I think, and it was stayed by the court. It was suspended by the court for 3 years to allow the legislature to take actions to try to address this. One of those possible actions would be to connect some of the communities around White Bear Lake to surface water. So you may know that Minneapolis and St. Paul and a number of their suburbs rely on surface water from the Mississippi River. I live in Fridley, and that's the intake for both of those pipes to go to St. Paul and Minneapolis. And instead of coming up with a solution that would reduce the pumping, no one did anything. And so the case then moved forward, and eventually Judge Margaret Marinan, who is the decider in this case, found that there was impact to this White Bear Lake resource, and that it was caused in part by the Department of Natural Resources mismanagement of groundwater, and that they had allowed too much direct pumping of that groundwater aquifer, and it was having an impact on the lake. And so that decision has been, I think it was made a few years ago, and then it went through a number of appellate courts. MCEA was not a party to this lawsuit, but we did participate at the Court of Appeals and the Minnesota Supreme Court as what we call an amicus, so as a friend of the court, offering our opinion about the impact that it might have on environmental laws like Mira. So that's the getting us up to speed part. At the legislature right now, there are proposals to legislatively overturn the decision that Judge Marinan made to protect White Bear Lake and require the DNR to limit the amount of groundwater that would be taken out of that aquifer next to the lake. As Kevin said really pithily, I think, and you got it exactly right, what the legislature giveth, the legislature can taketh away. And in this case, because the lawsuit was predicated on the statutes as they existed in the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act, there's now an effort to overturn that decision by changing those statutes. and carving out an exception to the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act and other environmental laws in that 5-mile radius around White Bear Lake, functionally overturning the decision that the judge made and giving the DNR absolute authority that's not challengeable in court to make decisions about the amount of water to give to cities and other users in that 5-mile radius around White Bear Lake. And we support at MCEA, and we've been advocating and lobbying for money to go to a permanent solution, such as surface water interconnection, to address some of those water quantity issues, and also to help address some of the PFAS contamination that's causing a water quality issue that's nearby as well, and putting some communities in a real squeeze because they're trapped between polluted groundwater on their south and water to the north that is impacting White Bear Lake. And so we're hopeful that there will be some kind of progress toward a permanent solution during this legislative session. There's actually proposals on both the House and Senate side to put aside money for a task force or other kinds of studies to get this proposal moving to find a permanent solution. And we're fighting against the other proposals that would just use the blunt force of the legislature to overturn the decision by changing the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act and other Minnesota statutes that protect our water and our health.
In addition to that, I want to highlight a few things about this particular case that I think is worth noting. First is that this is a really good example of how nothing exists in a vacuum. We had, the courts and the legislature and the agencies and the reporters' news all kind of influencing what was happening in this case, all at the same time. And so this is a really good example of how it gets really messy and how nothing really exists kind of on its own. You can't completely separate what happens at the courts to what happens at the legislature to what happens in the news and what happens at the agencies. It all ends up kind of working together, and you have to take into account all of that when we work on stuff at the legislature. It's also a really good example of why we at MCEA need to watch cases that are not even our own, because we care so much about these bedrock environmental laws that we use. Any attack on those kinds of laws is an attack on our cases. So even though we weren't really directly involved in this case, it was something that we still had to step in and intervene on at the legislature because of the effects that it would potentially have on the rest of our court work. And then the last thing that I think that this case highlights is the direction of what we're going to see a lot in terms of problems in the state and what we're going to see more of the legislature, which is we have a problem with water. We don't know. In some places, there's not going to be enough water. In some places, there's going to be too much water. And we don't have a good interconnected system to be able to manage that flow of water into different areas. And so this is just one start of what this conversation is probably going to look like at the legislature. And so this is going to be a hot issue to watch going forward. We're going to see a lot more cases like this pop up at the legislature to try and find easy fixes, or what might be considered as easy fixes but are not easy fixes at the legislature to these problems. Anything else we want to talk about for White Bear Lake? Anything else to chime in on?
No, I just want to mention too, there were two other cases that were cases that MCEA was not involved in, but we were watching very carefully because they involved those environmental laws. That included a lawsuit that challenged Minneapolis's 2040 zoning plan, as well as a proposal to build a building near what they call the Witch's Hat in Prospect Park in Minneapolis. And both of those cases went to the appeals courts. And while there wasn't any legislative action there, our legal team was paying attention to those, and we submitted amicus briefs again to tell the court what the impact might be about the decision if they made a certain decision on environmental laws. So we're constantly monitoring these other cases that are in the same sphere as us, even if we're not the ones that are bringing those cases.
Yeah, that is a good point. This is not the only example by any means. So I would like to turn it over to some Q&A with what time we have left. So if you haven't already, please put your questions into the Q&A, and we're going to try to get to as many of those questions as we possibly can. And I want to start with one question that I think is a really good thing to talk about. And I think this question would be best directed at Kevin. So if the legislature changes our laws like Mira and Nepa and Napa, can we rely on any kind of federal protections? And what would it then look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit complicated. So as you all probably know, we have a number of federal laws that Minnesota has to comply with and the regulated industries have to comply with. A lot of the environmental laws at the federal level are implemented in a way that provides a role for the states, sometimes referred to as cooperative federalism. And so what the federal law provides is a backstop. That's the way that I think about it. Maybe kind of as, we can go beyond the federal law in terms of our protections that we offer the environment, but we can't go below what the federal law requires. So with the laws that I was talking about, NEPA, for example, there is a federal equivalent. It's called NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. But NEPA applies to any action where a state government is doing some approval, and NEPA only applies when it's the federal government giving the approval. So there are many, many more projects captured by NEPA than there are by the national NEPA. And if we lost NEPA altogether, I mean, there would be NEPA there, but it would apply to far fewer projects. With regard to Mira, there's not really a federal equivalent. So most of the federal laws do have what's referred to as a citizenship provision. So the Clean Water Act, for example, if somebody is violating the Clean Water Act, groups like MCEA could come in, depending on the situation, and potentially go to court and bring a claim against that polluter. But there's nothing so general at the federal level that provides a cause of action, the ability to sue somebody who is damaging the environment through their conduct. So I guess, yes, there are some protections at the federal level, but we have to be really protective of what our state offers us and offered us back in the 70s. Really, as I was thinking about these examples that people were talking about, NEPA and Mira, they were passed back in the 70s, and the history that I've experienced, at least, is just kind of a chipping away at the protections that are offered. Going back to the example that you were talking about earlier, Andrea, with NEPA, the environmental review law, and the proposal to limit the petition process to people who live in the county, for example. Well, a few years ago, when the statute was passed, all you had to have was 25 people to petition for environmental review. A few years ago, that went up to 100 people. And I think it went from people who could be any people living anywhere. So if you lived in Wisconsin and you had a cabin here, you could still petition, to residents of Minnesota. So it's kind of a chipping away at this environmental review requirement. I can remember a case that we brought, actually, it was a polymet related case, but way back in, 2008, when polymet was just initially proposed. And the IRRB wanted to give a bunch of money to polymet. And we said, you can't do that under NEPA. The state government can't make that kind of a decision until we know what the environmental consequences are of this proposal. The legislature immediately chipped away at NEPA and enacted an exemption for the IRRB. There's plenty of other examples in NEPA, ethanol, CAFOs, where we have pursued cases and then the legislature comes along and makes an exemption. And so the work that you're doing up at the legislature to beat back those attacks is just really important. They're constantly coming at us.
So what are the challenges then in being able to rely on some federal protections? That's kind of a follow-up that I'm seeing here in the questions. What could we face if we decided, oh, we don't need to rely on the state protections, then let's rely on the federal ones and put all of our attention there?
Well, I mean, we start with the Supreme Court. I mean, yeah, the Supreme Court is a real problem. I mean, and we mentioned earlier, for example, that the definition of what a federal water is in kind of question, and that's in part because of the Supreme Court choosing to take up that case. So I'm sure that Ann and Kevin will have better answers to this, but I just need to start by saying it's not going to surprise anybody who's been paying attention to the news today that the Supreme Court, being the ultimate backstop on this, is one of the bigger challenges of relying on federal law.
Right. I think it's really fair to say that the challenges that we face to defend our bedrock environmental laws here in the state of Minnesota, the same challenges exist at the federal level and sometimes within the federal court system, because the courts find ways to interpret the federal backstop laws in ways that narrow the jurisdiction of the federal government, which our experience suggests is typically helpful for defending the environment. So that gets, as Kevin said, eroded away. It gets chipped away by actions occurring at the federal level. And while MCEA doesn't lobby as much at the federal government, occasionally we do, but we do try to keep track of what's going on in the federal courts and what's going on in Congress to make sure our federal backstop laws are protected. With regard specifically to the Clean Water Act and the idea that the state would be the sole issuing authority for dredge and fill permits, I think legal scholars who have looked at this issue say that there are actually a lot of protections embedded in the Clean Water Act that even if we assumed it or we got delegated the authority to do it, we as a state would still have to comply with those protections. We would have to have adequate authority to really implement the program, including $10,000 per day fines. And we would have to still confer, for example, with the Fish and Wildlife Service from time to time. So, delegation, although I think some people, the 404 assumption, the delegation that program to the state, people see it as a great panacea. Let's get the feds out of here. Then we've got it all under control. But I think they need to think twice. And of course, then there is the cost to the state of running that program. And very, very few states have in fact taken on the authority of the wetland program.
Related to that, since you're talking about the 404 assumption again, Ann, there's the question of which waters we can assume authority over, right? So there are certain waters that are not assumable by the states, and all of the waters of the US, what is considered federal jurisdiction in water law, is totally up in the air right now. So I think that even if people did want to pursue assumption, I don't think that this is a very good time, just practically speaking, because the federal law is just not clear right now on what is a water of the United States. So figuring that out at the state level, I'm not sure why we would want to spend our resources on that.
So through this discussion, it sort of sounds like, if we were going to rely on federal protections or even wanting to rely on some state protections, it would be the most protected to have things in the Constitution because it can't be as easily changed by the legislature. So does anybody see any hope in having things in the Constitution for protections of our environment?
Well, I mean, I could note that there are some constitutional funds that, nevertheless, we find ourselves doing legislative defense work on. So I have to feather the edge a little bit about the bedrock environmental laws and not having things in the Constitution. When we do have things in the Constitution, nevertheless, certain elements in the legislature try to adopt laws that would, again, chip away or erode at what was the people's will when those provisions were adopted into the Constitution. So just because things get into the Constitution, again, it's not necessarily a panacea.
And changing the Constitution is super hard. I mean, like, there are only 26 amendments for a reason. And it's not going to be easy to change that at the federal level. At the state level, by the way, we can change our state constitution by a simple majority vote of the House and the Senate, and then a majority of voters voting for that provision at the next election. But even that's a challenge. And so we don't really even have that many Minnesota constitutional amendments, despite the much lower bar than there is for that.
So what can we do now that we've kind of concluded now that we have to defend at the state legislature all these court cases, and we have to continually do it? How do we do that? And how do we rely on our supporters to do that?
I mean, kind of start by saying, like, I think that obviously defending laws is a big part of what we do, and it's super important. But I think the best defense is a good offense in a lot of ways. And I think that having strong, strategic, smart initiatives to try to improve our environmental laws and take it away from like this idea that we're inevitably slowly chipping away, as Kevin talked about, at these really strong environmental laws we passed in the 1970s. I think we need a next wave of what the next thoughts are on this. And there's some really interesting thoughts in chat, by the way, about, I think upholding the sovereign rights of indigenous tribes is a big part of that. And you're seeing a lot of development of jurisprudence. Just today, we had a big recommendation and part of a decision related to that in the Polymet case. I know the Line 3 litigation was similar to that too, as well as previous litigation around the Dakota Access Pipeline. So, I think we also need to stand up for environmental law when it's challenged, but I think we also need to be constantly pushing for what the next approach should be, and how we make these laws stronger. Because I think if we concede that it's inevitable, these laws will slowly get chipped away at, we might lose slower, but we'll still lose. And that's not the way to approach the work.
I also think that one of the strategies at the legislature is to rely on things that are complicated to get them done quietly. And so our role is to demystify what is happening at the legislature so that it can be easily understood by our supporters, and really tell you what the impacts are. So I think finding, some organizations that you trust to decode things for you and to let you know what's happening at the legislature, and then following their action alerts, like one that we will share with you here today, that really help you engage with the legislature, and let them know that you are paying attention as a constituent and that you care about these issues. That is a really unique role that you, as constituents of these legislature, the people who vote in and out, the people who are at the office buildings, that really makes a huge impact. So I just see that the action alert was posted into the chat here to protect our bedrock environmental laws. So please follow that today. We are kind of running out of time here, but I wanted to open it up if anyone else has any last thoughts that they would like to leave our audience with today.
I just want to say one quick thing, which is there's some great questions in the chat. I mean, there's some really interesting, I'm really impressed by the folks' engagement on this issue. MCEA works on a lot of different issues, and I think there's one person who said that we didn't like to work on Line 3. That's not true. We represented clients in Line 3. We've been deeply involved at the agencies trying to highlight the impact on water resources, even after the construction was moving at pace. So, I just want to make folks aware that we are constantly engaged with agencies around these issues as well as at the legislature. And we really appreciate folks' attention to them, and keep it up. I mean, your job, part of the job of being a citizen these days is paying attention to what your government's doing and calling them out on it when you don't like it. So, we want to help you do that work, but you also, the work that you do is super important. So thank you for all you've done.
And I just want to call out Aaron and Andrea for all the good work that you're doing up at the legislature. You know, there are, I think, tons of lobbyists looking at energy and climate, which gets a lot of attention and a lot of funding, quite frankly. And in a lot of ways, MCEA is kind of alone in the breadth and the view that we're taking to environmental advocacy. And it's a huge job. You know, how many bills were introduced this year? Going through each one and trying to figure out, is this going to affect some interest of ours when we have, you know, these broad concerns beyond climate, beyond energy, with water, with waste, with the procedures that people can use to comment publicly or ask for a contested case hearing. The breadth is just really enormous, and I think that you're doing a great job of keeping on top of it. So thank you for that.
Yes, and thank you everybody for your really thoughtful questions. I just want to echo what Erin said. I think these questions that you've all put into the chat and the Q&A have really shown us the elevated level that our supporters are engaged in our work. And we couldn't do all this work without you and all of your engagement. So thank you for participating today. I hope that you learned a little bit more about our defensive work at the legislature and how our legislative and our court work is all connected. So thanks to all the panelists for this good discussion. And I hope everybody has a great afternoon. It's supposed to be beautiful today. So thanks, everyone. Bye.